Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into something you see more and more in cities, shared e-bikes. And specifically, this whole idea of micromobility being a climate solution. Cities are really pushing these shared modes, right? It's part of their strategy to fight climate change. But we know transport is a huge problem. I mean, it's responsible for nearly a quarter of global emissions. That's massive. So the big question we're tackling today is, do these shared e-bikes actually, reduce urban carbon emissions? Or is it more complicated?
It's definitely more complicated. That's the ambiguity we need to unpack. See, e-bikes, especially these shared ones, they're booming. They're an emerging mode, absolutely. But they're competing with everything. They compete with cars, which is great from an emissions perspective. High emission mode replace. But they also compete with walking or just hopping on a regular bike, zero emission modes. So the net effect, what they're actually substituting overall, well, it isn't immediately obvious.
Right. If they just get people off their feet for short trips, that might not help. Or could even potentially make things slightly worse in terms of overall system energy use.
Exactly. It's about that substitution. Are we swapping out dirty combustion engine miles, or are we swapping out footsteps?
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. Cut through that fog.
Right.
We've got two really interesting studies to look at. One's a huge data analysis from China, millions of trips. The other is a behavioral experiment from Switzerland. Should give us some solid answers. Let's start with just how big this e-bike thing is. The growth is pretty staggering, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely undeniable. The market projections are huge. We're talking about going from roughly $60 billion in 2025 to nearly $110 billion by 2034. That's not niche growth, that's mainstream adoption happening fast.
And you can see the appeal. They just make cycling easier for a lot more people.
Completely. That's the core of it. They tackle the main barriers of regular bikes. You can go faster. Hills aren't a struggle anymore. You can cover longer distances without getting exhausted. It makes cycling practical for trips that might have seemed too far or too hilly before.
Yeah, it sort of bridges that gap between a purely manual bike and, say, a scooter or even a car for certain trips. And I have to say, personally, for moving around the city, I almost always choose my bike or an e-bike over driving now. It's just, well, first off, it's way cheaper. No gas, no parking hassle, and you just sail past all the traffic jams. It feels way less stressful. Plus, you still get some exercise, even with the assist. It really does change your perspective on getting around town.
That personal experience really resonates with the wider trends. And it's being pushed along by a couple of key things. Technology, for one. Battery tech, specifically lithium-ion, has gotten so much better. More range, more reliable. And then there's policy. Governments are stepping in with subsidies, making them more affordable. But maybe even more important is the infrastructure investment. Dedicated bike lanes, charging stations, that makes it feel safer and more convenient, which encourages more people to try it.
Okay, so people like them, they're buying them, governments are supporting them, that's clear. But let's get back to the core environmental question. Are they actually cutting carbon? Let's dive into that Cambridge study from China. Chengdu and Kunming, right?
That's the one. A really robust study. They didn't just count bikes. They analyzed over 4 million recorded shared e-bike trips. And they used quite a clever model, a travel mode substitution model.
Okay, how did that work? How do they know what someone would have done?
Well, the model looked at the details of each e-bike trip, how far it was, how long it took, and crucially, what the public transport options looked like in that specific area. Based on those factors, it predicts the most likely alternative modes someone would have chosen if that shared e-bike simply wasn't available for that particular journey.
Makes sense. So what did they find? What were people ditching to hop on an e-bike?
Here's where it gets surprising, perhaps counterintuitive at first glance. Looking purely at the number of trips replaced, public transport was the biggest loser. About 43% of e-bike trips would have otherwise been on a bus or metro.
43%. Wow, okay. What else?
Next up was conventional cycling, regular bikes. That accounted for about 41% of the substituted trips.
So wait, public transport and regular bikes, that's over 80% combined. Where do cars fit in?
Cars were only the substituted mode for about 10% of the trips.
Only 10%. Hold on. So these e-bikes are replacing walking, biking, and transit way more often than they're replacing cars. 4 times more often, roughly. How does that lead to a reduction in carbon emissions? That sounds like it should do the opposite.
Ah, yes. That's the absolute critical point. You're right to question it based on trip counts alone, but it's not about the number of trips substituted. It's about the distance of those trips and the massive difference in emissions between the modes involved.
Okay, explain that.
The study found something crucial. Those 10% of trips that did replace cars, They were typically much, much longer journeys than the ones that replaced a walk or a short bike ride. Think about the emissions per mile or per kilometer. A typical car turns out around, say, 224 grams of CO2 per passenger per kilometer. It's very high.
Okay. And the e-bike?
An e-bike is incredibly low carbon in use. We're talking maybe 5 grams of CO2 per mile, orders of magnitude less.
Right, I see where this is going. So replacing one single long car trip saves a huge amount of CO2.
Exactly. That one substitution saves so much carbon, it completely outweighs the very small, almost negligible emission increases from maybe, dozens of shorter trips that might have replaced walking or conventional cycling.
So the sheer scale of carbon saved from displacing car miles dwarfs everything else, even though it happens less often.
Precisely. It's the high impact of those specific car replacement trips. And the net result, when you average it all out across those millions of trips, is that introducing shared e-bikes led to a quantifiable decrease in carbon emissions, on average between 80 and 150 grams of CO2 saved per e-bike trip.
Wow, okay. So despite the initial numbers looking worrying, the overall impact is positive. Quality over quantity for substitution. Now, you mentioned earlier things aren't the same everywhere.
Yeah.
This average reduction, does it hide variations? Does it work better in some parts of the city than others?
Yes, absolutely. That's another really important finding. This carbon reduction effect isn't uniform across the urban landscape at all. In fact, the study showed that in certain types of areas, e-bike sharing might actually lead to a small increase in CO2 emissions.
Really? Where?
Primarily in the dense, central, often mixed-use areas of the city.
Why there?
Because in those areas, trip distances are often shorter, and people already have good options for walking or using regular bikes. So when an e-bike comes along, it's most likely to replace those already green modes for convenience.
Ah, okay. So where do they have the biggest positive impact then?
The reduction effect was dramatically stronger, much, much bigger in specific sort of underdeveloped, non-central areas. Think lower density neighborhoods, places with less mixed land use, meaning you have residential here, shops way over there, lower accessibility generally, and often poorer public transport service.
They're more like suburban-style areas within the city limits.
Exactly. Places where people need to travel longer distances just for daily errands or commuting because things are spread out. In those zones, walking or traditional biking might not be practical for many trips. Their default option before the e-bike arrived was often the private car.
So in those areas, the e-bike is much more likely to be substituting for a longer, higher polluting car journey,
That's the mechanism. The geography dictates the likely substitution pattern.
which has huge policy implications, right?
Mhm.
It suggests that just dumping e-bikes in the busiest downtown areas might not be the best strategy environmentally.
It's a crucial takeaway. For maximum environmental benefit, governments and operators should seriously consider prioritizing deployment in these non-central, lower-density areas, even if, maybe they seem less profitable on the surface.
That really flips the usual deployment logic.
Okay.
Hey, let's switch gears slightly and talk about policy levers beyond just placement. How can we actively encourage that car to e-bike shift? This brings us to that Swiss study, the EBS one. They tested something called mobility pricing. What was that about?
Yeah, this was a fascinating field experiment. They essentially tried to make the true cost of different transport modes visible to users. Participants were given a mobility budget, but the cost of each trip wasn't just the ticket price or fuel, it included the external costs imposed on society.
External costs like?
Things like noise pollution, the cost of accidents, and, critically, carbon emissions. So, under this system, driving a car suddenly became quite a bit more expensive because its external costs are high. E-biking, on the other hand, had basically no associated external cost charged to the user in the experiment, and walking actually earned people a credit.
Earned credit. Why?
Because walking has positive externalities, it reduces healthcare costs for society, so they factored that in as a sort of negative cost.
That's clever. So you make driving expensive, biking free, and walking profitable. What happened? Did people change their behavior?
They absolutely did. The impact was quite clear. Participants in the experiment reduced the number of car journeys they took by 8.2%.
Okay, 8.2% reduction in car trips. Significant. And the carbon impact.
Even more impressive, they achieved a 25% saving in their total traffic-related CO2 emissions, a quarter reduction.
Wow. So directly showing people the hidden costs of driving really does push them towards cleaner options like e-bikes.
It provides strong evidence that pricing policies reflecting true costs can be a powerful tool for shifting behavior.
What kind of practical tools are we talking about that? How could a city actually implement this kind of true cost pricing? It sounds complicated.
Well, the study suggests a few mechanisms. The most straightforward, though maybe politically tricky, is simply a higher fuel tax that broadly reflects the environmental cost. A more targeted approach they mention is perimeter pricing. That's essentially a congestion charge, but maybe focused specifically on taxing car journeys into, say, the downtown core during peak hours. Makes the cost very direct and localized.
Right, congestion charges exist in some cities already, but these measures, higher fuel taxes, congestion zones, they often face real political pushback, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. The sources acknowledge that political will is necessary. Their focus is more on demonstrating that these tools work and what those tools could be. Implementation is always the tough part.
Beyond just pricing, did the Swiss study look at infrastructure? We mentioned dedicated lanes earlier.
Yes, infrastructure came up as well. They tracked where cyclists actually rode and, perhaps unsurprisingly, found that people actively avoid certain things. They avoid steep hills, they avoid roads with heavy, fast-moving traffic, and they avoid complex, dangerous intersections with lots of traffic lights. Safety is a huge factor.
So investing in making cycling feel safer directly encourages more people to do it.
Exactly. Things like physically separated cycle lanes, creating low-speed streets where bikes and cars mix more safely. These aren't just nice-to-haves, they are essential policy tools. Better, safer infrastructure leads to higher ridership, which in turn helps maximize that positive substitution effect away from cars.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered the growth, the surprising substitution effects, the importance of geography, and the power of policy. If you had to boil it all down to the single most important takeaway for someone listening, what would it be?
I think the core message is, yes, shared e-bikes can be a net positive for reducing urban carbon emissions. The data supports that. However, that success isn't automatic. It's highly conditional. It really depends on a smart, coordinated strategy. First, where you put them matters. Immensely prioritizing those lower density, car-dependent areas is key for maximizing the environmental win. And second, you need policies, especially pricing mechanisms like reflecting true costs, that actively nudge people out of their cars by making the environmental damage financially tangible. Get those two things right, and e-bikes are a powerful tool.
A clear, evidence-based conclusion. But, as always, we like to leave you, our listener, with something more to chew on. A provocative thought. Both these studies did a fantastic job quantifying the emissions during the use phase, when the bike is actually being ridden. But what about the full life cycle? Think about manufacturing those thousands of bikes. The batteries, the metals, the plastics. Think about the vans driving around, distributing them, collecting them, recharging them. The whole logistics network of the sharing economy. How much carbon does that generate? And could those cradle-to-grave emissions potentially chip away at, or even negate, the carbon savings we see during the use phase? The studies didn't fully cover that. That's something for you to ponder as we all think about the true cost and benefit of micromobility shaping our future cities. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope you found it informative and engaging. We'll catch you next time.